The one thing that comes through, at least my belief, is that it starts with trust. If people can't trust the people they're working for or with, don't bother. Life is too short. We don't buy from people we don't trust. We don't hang out with people we don't trust, right? I mean, it all comes down to trust. And trust for me is transparency. If people know what's going on in the organization and feel like management doesn't have some separate agenda, and that I'm just a pawn in that agenda, here to make someone else wealthy, then I'm really happy because I feel like I'm part of something bigger than myself and I'm helping a collective team. And that comes with trust.
This is the Entrepreneurs United podcast with your hosts, John St. Pierre and Rich Hoffman.
Today, we're sitting down with Bill Gruber. He's the author of The Leadership Blueprint, a guide for building and leading a high-performing team. Bill, welcome to the episode.
Thank you very much, guys. It's just an honor to be here. I love your podcasts. I've spent a bunch of time going through many different episodes and just thrilled with what you guys have put out. Very entertaining.
Well, we're excited to have you on the podcast, and you have 20 years of leadership experience. I think the one question I want to ask is, you wrote a book about the leadership blueprint. Can you give us maybe a little bit of a framing of why did you wake up one day and said, look, I got to write a book about leadership? What happened in that moment?
Yeah, and that's a fabulous question. So when I worked for big companies and small companies, so, I was a Procter Gamble guy right out of college, and then I worked for Boston Scientific, so big corporations, but then I left and started doing small startups, right? As an entrepreneur, venture-funded medical device startups, if you will. And throughout my career, because very early, even at Procter Gamble, I was managing others. And I was managing people who were twice my age, right? And I found management to be a bit of a challenge, right? How do you manage someone who's got a lot more experience in the industry than you do? How do you motivate them? How do you get them to achieve the corporate objectives or the department's objectives, your team's objectives, right? So kind of motivating, communicating, and how, as a manager, do we hire? And what I recognized throughout my career is the last couple of ventures I was with, I finally kind of found a system that made management not only really easy for me, but also the effectiveness of the team was just outstanding, right? So management got really easy, kind of like NASCAR drafting. Now I'm drafting, I'm not having to work so hard, and we're really going fast, right? We're really accomplishing a lot of things. And it was after I got done with my last venture, I said, I wish I would have had that book. I wish somebody would have told me that 20 years ago, because my life would have been so much easier if I had just finally realized that if you kind of put all these things together, and nothing that I do is like, I'm not splitting atoms here, right? I mean, these are ideas from others, but when you use them in a system, boy, managing others becomes much less burdensome, and the output's awesome.
One of the things you said was you motivate other people for the organizational objectives. And, nobody's fired up about, let's do 100 million this year. Like, that's our battle cry.
Yeah.
Like, beyond revenue, beyond profit, how do you get people engaged in a battle cry that they're fighting for the organizational objectives?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rich. And I think you hit the nail on the head, which is no one wants to go to work to make someone else rich, right? It's like, well, we're here to make the CEO as rich as we possibly can. I mean, it's really tough to get out of bed in the morning and, to get all fired up about that. But I think, what we discovered was we kind of set out what is the team's mission and vision? And the team's mission and vision, for at least for us, wasn't necessarily how much money we can make. It's how are we impacting other people's lives, right? And you can do that. You can do that regardless of the kind of industry that you're in. You have to be in the medical device industry. For example, if we look, I'm going to pick on John here a little bit. So if we look at, one of John's businesses, he has many businesses, if his job is to build other people's businesses for him, their structure, right? These guys are trying to build a business. How can we help them be successful, right? So what we need is what Rich just said. We need a rallying cry, which is not to necessarily make the CEO rich, for example, but let's say we're helping people have successful businesses. And then we need to define how we measure that, right? how do we measure someone else's success, our customer's success, right? That means that we need to make sure that we have, for example, at least for the medical device for us, we wanted people to improve their quality of life because they no longer had a specific disease or malady. In John's situation, he's helping people launch businesses. If they want to launch a business, he's going to go in there with his team. They're going to do the whole build out or a construction or whatever it's going to be with Brand Point. And honestly, it's going to be a fabulous thing. So then what does our team consider our own success to be? We're going to do 100, we're going to help 100 people launch their businesses, 1,000 people launch their businesses. And once we do that, if that's our success for this year, we're going to help 1,000 people launch their business this year. We know that helps us inherently, but the rallying cry is, how do we as a team help 1,000 other people launch their businesses? And then we say, okay, so if that's the overall objective, how many do we need a month? Well, we need 20 a month in order to try to achieve that, right? So then that becomes one of our key objectives in the company. If we consider success to be 1,000, we need 20 a month or 100 a month. Let's say it's 100 a month. The sales guys are like, okay, we need 100 a month. Customer service is like, we need 100 a month. The guys looking for subs say, okay, we need to build up our subs because 100 a month's a load, right? So what happens is what we do is we have these 6 major objectives to hit the overall mission of the company. And what we're now doing is we're dropping down below those. What are the key results necessary in order to achieve that, right? And so that may be, we need 5 referrals from vendors a month, right? So we need 10 new customers a month per sales guy. We need 85% of our vendors, of our subs, to be to be ongoing subs, right? So, and then what happens, this goes to Rich's point is, we need to drag those down to all the people below, and each of those tasks become their objectives, right? And so the sales guy's like, well, the head of sales like, well, we need 100 a month. So then he or she takes their salespeople and said, so how are we going to do 10 a month? And one of the key things that we did was a pre-mortem. So we list out the 6 corporate main objectives, and we do a pre-mortem, which is we all get in the room. And when I say all of us, the whole company, and we come up, and I run the whiteboard and keep my mouth shut, and we come up with all the ways we're going to fail to hit our objectives. And everybody loves this because it's just a pig pile. Well, we get a pandemic and 2 of our people leave and the economy turns sour and we end up with a regulatory problem and we don't have good customer service and we can't pay our vendors. And so what we do is we come up with a bad list. And then I go away, we shut that meeting down. I go away and get them and titrate that down to a list of common ones because a lot of them show up in the same spots. A week later, we go back in the meeting, we say, okay, so these are the things we need to hedge against, right? So let's come up with all the hedges we can, all the ways that we prevent these things from killing us this year. And that, surprisingly, becomes all the tasks below our objectives that we're trying to hit. They're all the hedges we have built in place to prevent failure. And so this pre-mortem meeting kind of sets the stage. The benefit is that everyone's doing it. And then what happens is since everyone's own 6 objectives, they titrate, they come down from the corporate objectives. Everyone knows that they're not doing some fool's errand. Their activities are tied directly all the way to the top mission of the company. And people then can connect their role in the organization and their own impact to the mission of the organization. And we don't just call it that, right? Every month, their manager sits down and says, okay, so how are you doing on your objectives and key results, right? The 6 that you have and all the line items underneath that are going to prevent that from failing, right? And so, and I share, as president, CEO, I'm sharing mine with everybody else's. And at the end of the month, I show them how I did. I missed on these 2, I've hit on these 3, right? And I'm accountable. I'm accountable to you because all mine go to driving the mission. And CEO, mine are like, I got to fundraise. I got to close on $10 million by the end of the month. Otherwise, we're out of business, right? I got to hire 2 people because we're short 2 people. We got to expand, right? Here's how it's going, right? And then below that, I got to make 10 calls a day, or I've got to look at 5 resumes a day. right? So all those things build up. The thing that happens is everyone's activities are tied to the mission and everyone feels like they're important in the organization. But all the objectives and all the key results and objectives are SMART objectives, right? They're measurable, they're time-based, right? They're achievable. They all have a figure associated with them. It's 5 a week, it's 5 a day, it's 10 a day, it's done by this month, right? The other thing we did is we got rid of performance reviews. Because performance reviews are just, and I have written, with big companies, I've written some of the most worst performance reviews ever. When we go to objectives and key results, you have a 30-minute sit down with your boss every month, and you're sitting down and your boss is sharing their success and failure of theirs, and the employees sharing their own. And you're doing that every month. And so you can, steer on the bounces. There's no need to sit down in December or January and try to talk about things that happened 12 months before, right? And people then get recognition much quicker. They're being recognized for their successes. You can catch things that are starting to fall apart sooner, et cetera.
I like the idea of the pre-mortem. Everybody I think has heard of a post-mortem. Never heard of the term pre-mortem. I like what you did there. When you come up with all the ways to fail, how do you prioritize those? I can only imagine beyond like likelihood and maybe impact or something like what's the blend of how you evaluate the points of failure to prioritize? Because you certainly can't come up with behaviors to compensate for every single possible of the 100 ways. What's the method you use to prioritize?
Yeah, it's likelihood and impact, right? So part of it's the biggest ones we think can knock us off. Some are ludicrous. Some are so remote they'll never happen. So you can discount those pretty quickly, but it's pretty obvious. And honestly, it's very enlightening because some people in the organization come up with ways that are going to kill your plan that you never thought of. And so you can be like, man, that really would have bit us. That we wouldn't have seen it. It would have bit us. We got to start paying attention to that. But what we do find is there are a lot of similarities. Maybe it's people. Maybe we have to do a better job at hiring people because we're really understaffed. So then that becomes a big nut, right? And we need to maybe put that in 4 or 5 people's objectives so that we have 4 or 5 people working on that one thing that's going to bite us, right? But we know if we do all those hedges, all those things that are going to prevent us from failing, there's no reason we shouldn't hit our overall mission and objective for the year, right? Because we built it based on what's going to kill us, and let's make sure we have a plan for every one of those things that are going to kill us. And in the end, for us, Rich, it was probably no more than 5 or 6 per objective. Here's our objective. What are the 5 or 6 things we need to guarantee that we got to have a handle on these things in order for this thing to happen? It's usually 5 or 6. If the list is longer than that, it's not going to happen.
I think it's catchy to say throw out performance meetings or performance reviews. However, I think what you're actually doing is you're just increasing the number of them and the frequency of them so that they're more relevant. So it's not performance reviews aren't worth it. You're just saying performance reviews every 3 months, quarterly. That makes it highly relevant. You can make more adjustments over the course of the year to make sure everybody's coming in on hitting their metrics versus waiting once a year.
And we're doing them monthly. So so the mandate is you're with your manager for 30 minutes a month and really no longer than that. And then on a quarterly basis, we revisit all the objectives. So everybody gets a new set of objectives every quarter. And you do that at lunch with your manager for an hour. You go down 1 hour, you sit with your one-on-one with your manager for lunch. We're paying for sandwiches off-site and just sit down and go through what the next quarter's objectives are going to be. And we're taking out our company's objectives every quarter as a team, the whole team, and we're reviewing them and making sure that how we do for the quarter, do we need to make any adjustments, right? So the whole group is seeing a new set of objectives every quarter. Some of them are the same. Some of them are different because we achieved those other ones in the quarter. And then again, everybody gets real used to taking the top objectives and making those their own and how personally they're going to impact quarterly objectives for the organization, because we do want to hit those goals. We know those goals feed into the mission of the company.
So, Bill, I want to kind of recap what you've outlined so far, because I think it's really impactful. And I think there's a lot of companies that stop at one step or the other. And then I want to take us in a different direction after that, because I think there's an area that I think is a big weakness for a lot of companies, including my own. Have a mission and vision. Okay. You need to have a mission and vision. If you don't have a mission and vision, don't pass go, do not collect 200. Go figure that one out, right? Go get your rallying cry for your company, or else you're dead in the water, right? Then your company needs some objectives, some quarterly objectives for the company that will help them march towards their vision and mission. Okay,
Yes.
got it. A lot of companies stop there. They don't cascade those objectives to say, okay, as the CEO, these are my objectives. So now everybody that works on my team needs to then take those objectives and develop their objectives. And then beyond that, further down the organization is kind of that cascading effect where everybody has objectives. And what I love about what you said that I think a lot of CEOs do not do is then be transparent and accountable to the objectives you said to the organization you're going to do this quarter, and come back and say, hey, hit, miss, or all hit or all miss, or be accountable to what you say you're going to do, which increases the accountability for everybody else saying, well, the CEO's doing it, I also got to be accountable. And then something I've never done, and Rich, I'd love to know here if you've ever done, is the pre-mortem on the objectives to go, what's going to prevent us from hitting these objectives? I think we do that post-mortem more than we do pre-mortem. I don't think I've ever done a pre-mortem on our objective. Rich, have you ever done that?
No, not by that language. I think I love it. It's catchy language, because a post-mortem is always like, hey, what worked? What didn't work? How do we make sure it works better next time? And this is really catching that ahead of time. Of course, there have been some conversations here and there about, hey, what might come up that would get in the way. But nothing as formal as what Bill outlined, and I love it.
Yeah. So, Bill, I guess I have a question on the pre-mortem just to make sure I get this right if I was to implement this in my company. Do we say, here are the objectives of the company / the CEO? Okay, now let's do a pre-mortem on them? Or are we doing the pre-mortem before we determine what the objectives are for the quarter? When do you do the pre-mortem, I guess is my question.
After you have the objectives. Great question. So, and the objectives, the other thing is I don't just come up with the objectives and lay it out to the company. I put us all in a room and say, if this is our mission, right? What is going to allow us to achieve the mission? Let's find 6 major items that the company has to execute in order for us to hit that mission. And that is how we define success. If we hit all these objectives, we've defined success towards our mission. And it's not just a mandate from on high. Then, right, that's when we then do a pre-mortem and say, okay, let's beat the crap out of these objectives. What are all the reasons we would fail at hitting those objectives? And then the meeting's over, right? And it's a pig pile, right? It's a mess and it's chaotic. You just want to write as fast as you can. Then it's your job as a CEO or the leader or the manager of the organization to try to titrate those down, because there's a lot of repetitive ones in there, to a solid group. And then that solid group gets dispersed among those 6 objectives as key results, that things that we must do in order to prevent those objectives from being hit. The other thing you said, John, which is real important, which is I have 6 objectives, and under each objective, I might have 4 or 5 tasks that are my hedges preventing failure of my objective. The people below me are taking my 5 key results and making them their new objectives.
Correct.
My results become somebody else's objective, and they're going below that and putting in key results that allow them to hit that. And this is not my doing. This is all Measure What Matters by John Doerr, right? Great book by John Doerr, Measure What Matters. And so it's the objectives and key results, OKRs, very, very well-known book. And it's management by objectives by any other name. There's a bunch of people who've written about it. John Doerr's book was fabulous. And I rolled this out to my board. One of my venture capitalists go, oh yeah, we do that. We've read John Doerr's book and we subscribe to this. So it's spelled out very succinctly. In the book that I did, I come up with how to do a steak dinner, because you can do the whole thing with us, if we were more of a steak dinner type of thing. So, and John, the other thing you said with, you have to have your mission, your vision. My favorite book for that is Simon Sinek's Start With Why.
Of course. Absolutely.
It's, because it's all about the ultimate person impacted by your company. right? It's not just make $100 million. It's how are we changing people's lives, right? So start with why is what gave us our mission vision, all of our objectives and key results. How we set all those up by John Doerr's, initial what matters.
So great segue to where I wanted to go next. I always start a strategic planning session with start with why video playing on the board every single time, thousands of times potentially. And the one thing Simon Sinek talks about in that video is if people believe in what you believe in, they'll work with you with their blood, sweat, and tears, right?
Yes.
If they don't, they'll work for you for your paycheck. And there's something in your model that we haven't talked about yet that I think is really relevant and really difficult for entrepreneurs and businesses to get. But once they can drift behind the NASCAR like you talked about. And that is to identify not only your values of the organization, but what are the absolute non-negotiable, we are going to live by these things. And if not, you do not belong here. And oh, by the way, we're also going to measure our hiring by those values and do behavior health-based interviewing so that we hire the people that match what are not, what we need in this organization. And we'll also terminate based on that misalignment. I've been in this position. I'm sure you've been in this position. Rich has been in this position. Entrepreneurs listening to this are in this position today where they have people in their organization that do not align to their values. But yet when you sit down with them and you say, well, what are your values? What are your non-negotiables? What are your to live by? Like if you don't fit this box, you're out. Sometimes they struggle with that analysis. How would you recommend entrepreneurs look at identifying their non-negotiables and then implementing that into the hiring and termination decisions in their business?
Yeah, great. It's a great question. So for us, having run a couple startups, we sat in a room and I had a list, in the back of my brain as to how I generally wanted to try to guide some things. And for me, and I've got my list of values right out here, but, my kind of hot buttons, I wanted their input because I want this to be a team effort on how we all agree to do things. But, for mine, be accountable is kind of paramount. If you are not accountable, then there's not a place here for you whatsoever. And I think it was Adam Grant in his book, and he's written many great books, not only has his value, but he also, just to drive the point home, he has an anti-value, right? So let me give you an example. So like if it's be accountable, right? If we're going to see, we must, own our own successes and failures, keep commitments we make to ourselves, our patients, our customers. The anti-value is assigning blame. Okay, so that drives be accountable home. The next for us would be a team-minded problem solver, right? The anti-value of a team-minded problem solver is worrying about getting credit, right? So you're trying to reinforce, again, both positively and negatively, what do we mean by a value? Discuss bad news early. Anti-value is refusing to recognize problems needing attention, right? The other one for us, and especially in startups, have a strong sense of urgency, right? The anti-value is procrastination, right? The other huge one for me is hedge everything. The anti-value is assuming the plan will work, right? So as I go through here, I'm trying to not only say the value, but also demonstrate what failure of the value is, right? And so if I can list what failure of that value is, it's really easier for me to make an assessment as to someone who doesn't possess that value. One of ours is being transparent, right? The anti-value is do it because I told you to. Be coachable. The anti-value is I know better than you do. For us, do the right thing. We're in the medical device business. Do the right thing. The anti-value is profits come first. In the medical devices, if profits come first, then you're in the wrong business, right?
I see you practicing transparency even in your suggestion of measure what matters and start with why. There are a lot of people who want to conceal where their original inspiration was from because they want to create their method, their brand. It's unique. It's me. So I want to dig into that for a quick minute and go, so people can go buy the book, start with why, or buy the book, measure what matters. Tell me about your book. What does your book contribute to the world that the combination of those two books doesn't quite get, that prompted you, hey, there's something missing in this, and I have something to contribute to these theories that isn't there if you were to just read those two?
Yeah. And I think the one thing that comes through, at least my belief, is that if you don't, it starts with trust. If people can't trust the people they're working for or with, don't bother. Life is too short. We don't buy from people we don't trust. We don't hang out with people we don't trust, right? I mean, it all comes down to trust. And trust for me is transparency. If people know what's going on in the organization and feel like management doesn't have some separate agenda and that I'm just a pawn in that agenda here to make someone else wealthy, then I'm really happy because I feel like I'm part of something bigger than myself and I'm helping a collective team. And that comes with trust. And let me give you an example. So in our startup companies, we make no revenue initially, right? I take a bunch of venture money in, we design and develop a product, and we're just burning cash every month, right? So and sometimes we make it 4 or 5 years and there's no revenue, zero revenue, because we have to get FDA approval first, right? Everybody in the company knows what our daily burn rate is. They know how much money we have in the bank because I tell them. We have $5 million in the bank. Our last day of cash is, July 31st, 2027. We're burning $5,000 a day. So then I tell them, we're burning $5,000 a day. Every day the project gets pushed out by a day, we lost $5,000. So it's worth it for us, as we all make decisions in this company, to spend $4,999 to bring the project in a day, right? Because that saves us all. And we're all here because we all want a job, we want to work together. But a fascinating thing happens when people have that level of information. They make decisions differently. They start thinking about things differently. They start hedging everything, right? And the classic is, in a big company, somebody says, well, gosh, this raw material's delayed 2 weeks, right? And I said, well, how big's the order? Well, it's $3,000. And you're like, wow, it's delayed 2 weeks. We're burning $5,000 a day. So call them back and see if we can expedite it. And they call, in the big company, they would say, yeah, we don't want to expedite it. Like, why? He's like, it's a 50% upcharge. It's $1,500 more to get it a week earlier. I'm like, okay, if we're burning $5,000 a day and you can pay $1,500 and have it here 7 days earlier, my next response is, how about today at 2, right? Because I'll pay $15,000 to have it today by 2, right? It's just a different mindset. What happens is that, and this goes right to what John's it's entrepreneurs, right? It's entrepreneurship. It's having people who are starting to think like they're owners of the company because you're sharing all this information. And they feel like through objectives, key results, the mission, everything else, everything they do all day, every day, they have the information because you've given it to them and the resources and the plan to be as straight a line impactor to the mission as possible. And if we can draw that line from the employee to the mission as straight as we can, they don't feel like their boss has them doing some wild goose chase project that's just going to make the boss look good, because we've all done that before, and that's no fun. And so that, Rich, is the point to this, is how do we take all the noise away and show people the straightest line of their impact to the organization and then give them all the information. More information than most people ever feel comfortable giving. The only thing I don't share with my people is compensation. But everything else, how much money we have in the bank, when we run out of money, how am I doing on my own objectives? How am I raising money? Who am I talking to for venture capital? You've got to spill that out. You've got to give them trust if you expect trust from them.
So one of the things it sounds like you really bring on in your book is this development of transparency and trust. It kind of supercharges the whole system. You've got this phrase you use around creating tours of duty for all employees. Can you expand on what that is and how does that contribute to developing trust?
Yeah, it's great. Great question. So, and that comes from another book that was The Alliance by Reid Hoffman, right? Is he kind of formalizes it. It's happened throughout my career, but I think he does a nice job of trying to roll it all up. And that is that everybody in the organization, if we can, let's move them to different parts of the organization if they want and are so willing. Can we take a customer service person and put them in the sales field because they've always wanted to go into sales, but have demonstrated acumen they can do that? I'll give you an example. I had an office manager who was extremely capable. And during one of our monthly meetings, I said, so what do you want to do with your career? Are you happy doing what you want? Or do you want something more? She's like, I really like what the clinical research consultants are doing. I'd like to become a clinical research consultant. I said, okay, we'll make you a clinical research consultant. So she certainly had the aptitude. I started putting her in the field with one of the local research research associates that we had. And she took to it like nobody's business. Next thing you know, she's moved from that job into a clinical research associate. And by then, I could either replace her with someone else or I did not replace her. And the same is true at Boston Scientific. We had engineers who wanted to become salespeople, and Boston Scientific had a program. If you wanted to go through sales training and become a sales representative, fine, we can do that for you. You're going to go through the same training as everyone else. What ends up happening in the organization is quite fascinating because you've cross-pollinated all this knowledge from these various departments throughout the organization. The other fascinating thing is the communication lines between the departments start opening up because people have moved between the departments, and you don't end up with people who are all in these nice little silos with tribal knowledge and no one knows what the other sides are doing because you're moving people around the organization. For the individuals, they feel like they're building their value. They're building their own personal value, and maybe they get promoted in the organization. But candidly, if they get promoted to a better job outside the organization, that's okay too, right? They may go out and get great experience somewhere else, and then I'll go hire them back for a higher job later. That's fine as well. But what we can't do is just look at these people as tools to build me wealth. We have to give back to these people and at least be willing to try them in different parts of the organization, because it makes the overall fabric of the organization much stronger if we end up sharing the knowledge between all these groups.
So, Bill, you know how you gave us kind of the anti-values, right? So if you have a value, what's the anti-value? If the value you have in your organization, and maybe it's not one of your top core values, but if one of your values is to provide people with these opportunities at tours of duty and honor, what's the anti-value of that?
What would be anti-value?
And before you go there, here's what immediately came to mind to me. When somebody doesn't work in a particular role and they're not a good match and they're causing problems in the organization because they're just not efficient in that particular role, I think a lot of entrepreneurs try and move them to another role in the business, assuming that they may work over here because they failed over here. That's not a tour of duty in my mind. That's a little bit of a tour of failure. And I've never had that work for me before. And so, so when I thought about it, when you were talking about the tour of duty, I'm like, what a great way to honor somebody who's selling in a role and allow them to continue to flourish their position. But what I see a lot is an entrepreneur taking somebody who's not succeeding in a role, failing in a role, and saying, well, I don't have the guts to terminate this person because they're a good person. So I'm just going to move them over here so they can fail over here now. And I just want to make sure that that's not, that's not what we're talking about.
That is a great point, because I think we've all seen it, right? We've seen it interdepartmental too, where you're just moving a problem and hoping that it solves itself. And that is not a good solution, right? And the best solution is to say to the employee, I really want you to be happy, but you're not going to be happy here, right? And we got to find a better place for you. And, I think one of the things, and I'm working on another book just because it's like the Harry Potter brain sieve. I have to get this stuff out of my brain, which is how to fire people, right? We need to do it with the guts or the fortitude to step up and make that decision, to have that hard conversation. I will tell you, if you're having monthly meetings and you're reviewing monthly objectives and quarterly objectives, it's readily apparent when someone is not obvious to both parties. And that discussion becomes easier, right? Because, hey, we sat down for the last 3 months and you just haven't hit it. We all agreed what your objectives were going to be, and you're missing them because they're all very objective results that you have to hit, and you're just not hitting them. And so I think that's where a person's you got to move them out. And the other one too is we can't be afraid to not only move people out, but promote people out of the organization as well.
Sure.
Going back to kind of tours of duty, you will really attract people who want to be there because they see others have had great career tracks by coming and working in your organization, right?
Yep.
And so that gets around, and it's much easier to hire.
Yeah. Well, Bill, you've built a blueprint for building and leading high-performing teams, and it's a pretty systematic and simple thing to follow, yet it's so hard when you're actually in the seat, running a business, things are coming at you left and right, and you have to get disciplined to these methodologies, otherwise, right, the tail starts wagging the dog. How can our entrepreneurs learn more about the leadership blueprint, get the book, learn more about you, and continue to fine-tune their skills in this area?
Yeah, they can go to my website, which is www.billgruber.com. And under downloads, I have my entire recruiting binder. It's about a 60-page Word document on hiring for our values, but it can be adaptable to anybody's values. So you just download it, make it your own, but you just plug in your values and the whole system's there, and anybody can download it. So thank you guys very much for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Awesome. Thanks, Bill. Thank you.
Stay tuned as John and Rich unpack today's conversation.
John, I love that simple question that Bill had to wrap around vision and meaning. How are we impacting other people's lives? And then he took that into the follow-up question of, and how do we measure that? And that then starts this whole process of measure what matters, that he has found a way to be able to operationalize and then infuse this transparency and trust. And I think he's really on to something. And I think it starts with that original question. How are we impacting other people's lives?
You know, Rich, I can appreciate what you're saying. It starts with that question. Unfortunately, I think what I experience in companies is that question gets asked and there's a really good working session around it, but the follow through all the way down the chain. And one thing he said, you have to draw a straight line from every single employee back to the mission. I think that is where everything breaks down. And the larger your team, the harder that is to do, especially if you don't have a systematic way of cascading everything down through your organization. So what I've seen a lot is really good productive sessions about what do we do? Why does it matter? How can we really impact people? What is it? And then people leave that meeting and there's no line drawn to every single person that comes into that mission. And therefore there's not a thread that kind of goes through that organization, right? And then the goals don't align, the objectives don't align, people don't care as much, and you don't really get that full effect. And so I'm curious, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. You know, how can we as entrepreneurs create systems that doesn't just stop with that meeting? And Bill talked about the system that he has, but what are some other core principles you've seen that can really help take that initial meeting of like, what are we really here for and why does it matter, and get it through?
Well, I don't know that at the moment I'd go, well, I have a formula and I'd consider myself an expert at it. I have an opinion on some things and a little bit of experience. I think the follow-up question that he had is as important, if not more important than the original question. How do we impact people's lives? How do we measure that? And then I think it goes from how do we measure that, and then how do the different departments end up contributing to that measurement? And how do we measure the department's contribution? And then how do we measure the individual's contribution to the departmental contribution? It kind of comes back to how EOS is often run, where you've got organizational rocks and then broken down into departmental or divisional rocks that then further break down into individual rocks. And I think when that happens and there's alignment on individual rocks to departmental to organizational, that's where you get that thread. One of the breakdowns with a lot of companies on how they implement EOS is they really just focus on the individual rock level and what does everybody need to do? And so it just becomes a group accountability session about, is everybody doing what they need to do? But there's not actually alignment to a common objective. So when this is done, it's not that's all that person's job is, what those individual rocks are. No, they kind of have a day job, if you will, that they need to do things to keep the lights on. But we're going to hold specific accountability to these rocks, which do have alignment. Every single behavior that everybody in the company has every single moment of the day can possibly be aligned with organizational objectives. But we can have periodic reviews, weekly at least, where we're looking at, okay, how are you doing on what your deliverables are to the departmental objectives, to the organizational objectives?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned EOS, because the word that was in my mind when I was asking you the same question, like, how do you make sure it doesn't break down? You come up with a mission and vision, but then it doesn't cascade through, or things don't happen. And the word that came to mind was discipline. Do you have a disciplined process for how you're going to run your organization to make sure it doesn't break down? Because if you don't have a disciplined process, you're just kind of running from meeting to meeting, making it up as you go. And that doesn't work. And yeah, there's another part of this conversation I think is really going to stick with me post-recording, which is this idea. I've always had this healthy dose I call paranoia. Not unhealthy dose of paranoia, but a healthy dose of paranoia, where you're always wondering, okay, what can go wrong here? But I've never taken the approach of hedge everything. And the anti-value of that, which I also love the idea of anti-value, is it really crystallizes it, is the anti-value is assume the plan will work. Way too many times I've taken we develop a budget, it's going to work. We develop a plan, it's going to work. We never hedge it with, that idea of let's talk about all the reasons in a pre-mortem why this is not going to work. Let's talk about those and put action steps in place to make sure we're actually having counters to those hedge measures in place. We just set goals and assume the goal is going to be hit. We set a budget, we assume the budget is going to be hit, and we do not hedge ourselves appropriately as entrepreneurs. I think that was a major, major takeaway.
And you know what I didn't ask Bill that I should have in hindsight? Does he also recommend doing a post-mortem? Because it'd be interesting in blending the two. I imagine that pre-mortem just gets better and better and better.
I agree.
When there's a post-mortem. So, what were the points of failure we didn't even predict last time, if there was a failure or objectives weren't hit? And could that point of failure come up again? So just the learning from a post-mortem and using those gaps learned in a post-mortem when you're doing the next pre-mortem, I could see that being a really powerful 1-2 punch.
Yeah, but if you think about it, if you're continuously doing pre-mortems every quarter, and the only reason you would do a post-mortem technically is if you missed something or something didn't work, right? The way that you planned it. So you still have that objective as a company. So your pre-mortem would actually cover the post-mortem if you do it consistently. So I actually think the response to that, I could be wrong, I'm going to ask him as well, but I think the response is, if you continually do pre-mortems every quarter, in your pre-mortem discussion, you're going to talk about the hedging you'd have in place because last quarter you did it. And you missed this pre-mortem component that was missing. It would be my guess, but I think this whole post-mortem world it's too late. It's too late to think about why we should have prevented it. But the pre-mortem, if you do that on all of your plans, I think can make a lot of sense. But listen, I think this idea again of cascading things to organization and having this clear line of sight to what you're there for. And then the piece, Rich, that I mentioned, I just learned this recently. It's worked really, really well for my companies and other companies that I'm coaching, is this whole individual analyzer from Traction, the EOS method, where you literally take every single person in your company and evaluate them on all of your core values. Do they get it? What are the capacity to do it? And if they can't achieve, pluses in those boxes, why are they there? They don't align to your values. You got to root them out of your business. That has really opened a lot of eyes for myself and other entrepreneurs to be like, you have to have the right people on the bus too, that believe in what you believe in. They believe in your why and your mission, your vision and your values. If not, you're having a hard time going where you want to go.
I like what you're bringing up with that people analyzer. One of the things I found is when people end up having so many points of evaluation for so many people, and especially when that's brought into a leadership team, it can be like, we have 1,000 data points now that somehow we need to figure out and synthesize. what I found is if you want a way to do that, that is just super simplified, pulling a page out of Chris Mersaw's book, who we had on from Top Grading, president of Top Grading, the 3 attributes or elements, questions you need to ask about a player is, do they exemplify the culture? Plus or minus. Obviously, you would think about the values at that point, but plus or minus or plus minus. Are they a high performer in their role? Plus or minus, plus minus. And then that last question would be, would you enthusiastically rehire them? Plus or minus, plus minus. So if you ever find yourself, John, in a place where there's just so many data points, simplifying it that way, I found is an option. I recently did that with an entrepreneur, which is why I'm speaking to it.
I love that. Well, if you want to learn more, and Bill left us some gifts. He has the recruiting binder and an onboarding binder. 2 things I know a lot of entrepreneurs that could really use at billgruber.com/downloads. Go get your free copy today. Rich, good talking to you, and we'll talk to you again next week.